Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be doing a reading from manuscript page 100 of the Oera Linda Book. This is the second part of what we call the primal teachings, and it talks about what sets the beliefs of the Freya apart from the beliefs of some of the other groups mentioned in the manuscript. It's a fitting reading for today, especially in light of the funeral ongoing right at this moment of one Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who styled himself Franciscus, meaning the Frank. The Franks are mentioned in a few places in the Oera Linda manuscript. The first being on manuscript page 155, where we are introduced to Adel, the first son of Friso, and his wife Ifkia, who was also known as Swabina, taken from the tribal name Swabi, and from which we have the modern name Zabina. I'll read from this section. I have to start a little bit before it for context. So they're traveling through the lands, and it starts. As they had been descending for some time towards the delta, and had reached the region of the Old Burg Aachen, 4 of their manservants were unexpectedly murdered and stripped naked. They had fallen a little behind. My brother, who was present on all these travels, had often forbidden them to do so, but they had not heeded him. The brutes who had done it were Twisklanders, who nowadays boldly cross the Rhine to kill and rob. The Twisklanders were banished and fugitive children of Freya, but their wives they stole from the Tartars. The Tartars are a brown Findas folk, thus named because they provoke, Tarta, all nations to battle. They are all riders and robbers. This is how the Twisklanders have become so bloodthirsty. The Twisklanders who had committed this crime called themselves freemen or Franks. The second mention of the Franks comes in the very last section on manuscript page 209. I'll read the section to you here. Among the Twisklanders, there were 2 tribes that did not refer to themselves as such. The one came out of the far southeast and called themselves Alemana. This name they had given themselves when they still roamed the woods as exiles without wives. Later, like the Lithuanians, they had stolen wives from the slave peoples, but they had kept their name. The other tribe that roved closer by called themselves Franks, not because they were free, but because Frank had been the name of their first king, who, supported by degenerate maidens, had made himself hereditary king over his folk. So as we celebrate the demise of Franciscus, the Frank, I'm going to read to you from the Primal Teachings on manuscript page 100. I'll read a short section before we jump into the main reading. The second part of the Primal Teachings. Among Finda's folk there are pretentious men who, by their over-inventiveness, have grown so vain as to convince themselves and their initiates that they are the best part of Wralda, that their mind is the best part of Wralda's spirit, and that Wralda can only think through the help of their brains. To give a bit more context about who these pretentious men were, I'm going to read from the section starting on manuscript page 198.19, which we call Streams of Blood. Have a listen. To be well understood, I must now interrupt my story of the Scots and write something about the Hither Greeklands. The Hither Greeklands here is what we now call Italy. Far back, the Hither Greeklands belonged to us alone. But from time immemorial, descendants of Lyda and Finda have also settled there. Of the latter, a whole host eventually came from Troy. Troy was the name of a city that was conquered and destroyed by the folk of the far Greeklands. After the Trojans had nestled in the hither Greeklands, with time and vigor, they built a bastion of walls and towers named Rome, meaning expansive and renowned. When that was done, this folk succeeded through deceit and force in mastering all the land. And further down, and the Roman priests who desire to have sole rule over the realm of earth cannot abide the Gola. First they wrested Massalia from the Phoenicians, then all the lands south, west, and north of it, as well as the southern part of Britannia. Everywhere they expelled the Phoenician priests, known as the Gola. In this way, thousands of Gola were compelled to flee to North Britannia. So here in this section of the Primal Teachings, Part 2, the pretentious men refers to the Roman priests. And in the context of the funeral of Franciscus, we are referring to a specific society within the Roman priesthood. An 1846 book, published in English in 1848, called The Secret Plan of the Order, should make clear the kind of people we're talking about. When their society had reached the 100th year of its existence, they composed a book in its honor. The symbols which decorate the frontispiece of this work sufficiently prove that they esteem the humblest member of their order as infinitely above the rest of mankind. They call themselves the Company of the Perfect. The contents of the volume accord with the arrogance of its emblems. And further down, they proclaim themselves the masters of the world, the most learned of mortal men, the doctors of the nations, the Apollos, the Alexanders of theology, prophets descended from heaven, who deliver the oracles in the ecumenic councils. The epitaph which they composed for Loyola strikingly exhibits their love of grandiloquence and their overweening pride. It runs thus: Whoever thou art who conceivest in thy mind the image of Pompey the Great, of Caesar, and of Alexander, open thine eyes to the truth, and thou wilt learn from this marble that Ignatius was the greatest of conquerors. So we're talking about the highest order of conceit that has lasted, apparently, several hundreds of years. Now I will begin the reading proper. On manuscript page 100, the second part of the Primal Teachings. Among Finda's folk there are pretentious men who, by their over-inventiveness, have grown so vain as to convince themselves and their initiates that they are the best part of Wralda, that their mind is the best part of Wralda's spirit, and that Wralda can only think through the help of their brains. The notion that every creature is part of Wralda's infinite being, this they have acquired from us. But their false reasoning and unrestrained pride have caused them to stray from the righteous path. If their mind were Wralda's mind, that would make Wralda very stupid, instead of sensible and wise, for their mind is constantly occupied with making appealing images, which they afterwards worship. But Finda's folk are a wicked folk, for although their phony wise men convince themselves that they are divine beings, they have created false divinities for the uninitiated, everywhere proclaiming that these divinities created the world with all that is therein, greedy divinities, full of envy and wrath, who demand to be honored and served by the people, who desire blood and sacrifice and demand rich offerings. But these vain, false men who allow themselves to be called God's servants or priests claim and collect and receive everything on behalf of divinities that do not exist, to keep it for themselves. They do all this with an easy conscience, as they imagine themselves divine and answerable to no one. If there are any who see through their tricks and try to expose them, these are caught by their henchmen and burnt for their heresy, always with solemn ceremonies in honor of their false divinities, but in truth it is only to protect the priesthood. In order that our children may be armed against their idolatrous doctrines, the maidens must impress upon them the following. Wralda existed before all things, and after all things he shall endure. Wralda is thus eternal, and he is infinite. Therefore nothing exists outside of him. From Wralda's life sprang time and all things, and his life takes time and all things away. These facts must be made clear and manifest to all who are wise, so that they might explain and demonstrate them to others. Once these things have been understood, say further, regarding our essential nature, we are thus part of Wralda's infinite being, as is the essential nature of all creation. Yet regarding our appearance, our characteristics, our mind, and all our thoughts, these do not belong to the being. All these are fleeting phenomena that appear through Wralda's life, which appear as they are through his wisdom and not otherwise. But because his life is perpetually progressing, nothing can remain stationary. Therefore, all creatures change in their position, their appearance as well as their minds. Therefore, neither earth herself nor any creature may ever say, I am, but rather, I was. Likewise, no man may ever say, I think, but only, I thought. The youth is larger and changed from when he was a child. He has other desires, passions, and ways of thinking. The man and father is different and thinks differently from when he was a youth. The same applies to the elderly. Everyone knows this. Since everyone thus knows and must acknowledge that one is continuously changing, one must also acknowledge that one changes every instant, also whilst one says, I am, and that one's thoughts change whilst one says, I think. Thus, instead of unworthily imitating the loathsome Findas and saying, I am, or even, I am the best part of Wralda, yea, through us alone can he think, we proclaim the following always and everywhere that it needs to be said. We, Freya's children, are emergences through Wralda's life, in the beginning mean and bare, but always becoming and advancing towards perfection, without ever becoming as good as Wralda himself. Our mind is not Wralda's spirit. It is merely a semblance of it. When Wralda created us, he lent us, through his wisdom, a brain, senses, memory, and many good qualities. By means of these we can consider his creations and his primordial Eva. From these we can learn, and about them we can speak, all and only for our own benefit. If Wralda had not given us any senses, we would perceive and know nothing, and we would be yet more helpless than a jellyfish that is driven forth by the ebb and flow. Thank you for tuning in today. Come back soon for more readings and in-depth analysis of the Oera Linda book.